By the time this video is posted, it will officially be the release for The Secret World of Briar Rose. I will be on book tour, so I will see you there at any of these cities, and you can check out other events I'm doing at readwithcindy.com/events. Otherwise, for those of you who are waiting for the book in the mail or picking it up from your bookstore or library, I hope you enjoy and have a very sad, sapphic summer. I did an essay on people.com a while ago about how my book came out of the closet before I did, and this is an anecdote that I like to share because I do think it's funny how I was extremely straight when I first wrote my book, and the story was also straight, and then at some point I decided that both the main characters would be queer, and I was like, haha, isn't this so funny how I'm straight but I'm writing something like this? Just me being silly and kooky as always, and now here I am with a long-term girlfriend of 4 years. So in this video, I wanted to expand this topic further and talk about why representation mattered in my novel, even when I thought I was straight. The book started off as a very straight, colorblind story before years later, I had revisited the draft and decided to incorporate race and sexuality, not so much because of diversity, but more so because I believed it would add layers to the narrative themes. And in general, I just want to reflect on representation in books and being an author of color and the dynamics in that come with publishing. So this is a writing video, not necessarily in terms of the technical craft, but more so just my rationale behind certain decisions. Like, my book was really a stale white loaf of bread, and now you can say that is woke agenda bullshit. And the journey that it took to get there is not for like the default reason that you would expect. Speaking of sexuality, I want to thank the Baylor College of Medicine for sponsoring today's video. Even though my book is not a romance, I have read plenty of spicy books on my channel, from romantasy to dark romance, and something that always happens in the comments section is people debating whether these stories are quote-unquote healthy for you or good for you. But there's no definitive answer to that because there's no actual research until now. The Baylor College of Medicine researchers are conducting a study for how sexual media, whether that's books, audio, video, affects women's health and sexual satisfaction. So if you're a woman between the ages of 18 to 35 and you live in the US, come take this survey with me. It doesn't matter if you are an avid smut reader or if you've never touched any adult material or if you're in the middle like me. They are open to all preferences because the point is to study what women are consuming or not. The survey only takes 10 to 15 minutes, it is completely anonymous, and they will not collect any of our personal information, and is approved by the Institutional Review Board. There's so much research about what men consume and barely any for women, so this is a great way to help move the future of sexual medicine for women forward. I'll have the link in my description for you to fill it out. Again, it's super short, and now let's get back into the video. First, I want to talk about how my book came out as queer before I did. I know this is hard to imagine because even when I identified as straight, I still had a very gay looking haircut, but trust me when I say that I truly was the straightest a woman could be. Growing up as a kid and throughout my adulthood, I never had any crushes on women, not even fictional characters. And I loved reading stories about straight relationships, and I wasn't even interested in any of the gay ones. And so naturally, all the stories that I wrote growing up were very heteronormative as well. In my stories, there was always a guy main character and a girl main character, and they would be polar opposites in personality and background, but they would have to embark on some kind of adventure together, and the romantic subplot would be that they fell for each other along the way. I really like that formula when I consume stories and when I wrote stories as well. So when I was graduating high school, I came up with this idea of a Sleeping Beauty retelling that takes place inside the princess's dream world. And the concept of sleeping forever would be an allegory for depression and suicidal ideation. So there would be the girl main character, Sleeping Beauty, and there would be the guy main character who is her opposite. He is a cynic who gave up on having dreams in the first place. He is a thief who intrudes upon the dream world and steals Prince Charming's place. And he's basically like the gruff, angsty anti-hero that challenges the manic pixie dream girl princess who's run away from reality. So that was the first draft. And then I didn't touch the story for 5 or 6 years because I wanted to focus on my design career. But during that time, there were a lot of things happening in my brain. I grew a frontal lobe. I became a lot more politically conscious of the world around me. I joined BookTube, and that also made me more conscious of the identities of the characters in books, and I was starting to think more critically about the stories that I was consuming. I also made a lot of gay friends too, and I was like the token straight friend in the group. And so when I revisited the story years later, the story that would be called The Secret World of Briar Rose, I became a little bit more open-minded, and I was like, wait, what if I just made them all women? How come there aren't many stories where men are the minority? Like, why do they always take up a lot of this storytelling? And if I made them both women, what would be the implications if there was a queer relationship instead of a straight one? man. And then my third eye opened as I realized I'm gonna make these bitches gay. Because I was thinking about the themes in my story and how it's about escaping an imaginary world where you can fully be yourself. It's a safe space where you can exist without danger or judgment that reality would normally bring. And this is an ideal place for anyone, obviously, but it would hit a lot different for women and queer people and people of color. And so to me, this small tweak of changing the characters' identities created new implications that would deepen the story's themes. I don't think me finding out I was queer later on had influenced this decision to make the characters queer, because as a writer, even like as a straight writer, to me, this just felt like the most logical decision to make the story better. So I was really excited about this new development that I was going to make in my story. And I decided to talk about it in a writing vlog, back when I used to post writing vlogs. But at that time, I couldn't share what my story was about. I wanted to keep the story to myself until it was ready to publish. And so as a result, I shared that I've decided I would make these characters queer. Yes, it is very funny that I'm writing about sapphic women, but I'm straight myself. Ha ha, hee hee. And I can't share why until later on because it's related to what the story's about. But, you know, it's going to be a good change in my opinion. And unfortunately, the internet will still find a way to judge anyway. There were people who were saying things like, oh, she's acting like she's being so revolutionary because she's a straight person writing a queer relationship. God forbid a girl is excited about new developments. There was someone who even said that I was probably writing a sapphic fantasy because I wanted to go along with the LGBT trend in publishing, which is weird because if I wanted to do that, why the fuck would I write about gay women? If I really had those intentions, I would have written about gay men fucking. That would have been more profitable and successful for me. So it was a bummer for me to see people make those assumptions about me without really knowing the story or full context and just like assuming malicious intentions, especially like intentions that seem so shallow in contrast to like the actual reason why I wanted to make it queer. Even if I knew the actual truth, I think I had like a weaker sense of selfhood where, you know, I didn't even really know myself. And I worried that, you know, maybe people were right and that I was like just queer baiting and I was only doing it for shallow reasons. And that made me a lot more self-conscious about how I talked about my story from then on, especially the queer aspects. It made me self-conscious about talking about any queer media. And then later on, as I contemplated removing the straight label, as I kind of, you know, would try to figure out what I really was, I would have doubts in the back of my mind where I was like, well, am I just removing the straight label so that I don't get any scrutiny for being straight? Am I just being unlabeled so that I can avoid any criticisms about me participating in making queer media? I think sometimes people on the internet can be quite restrictive about other people's identities, where if you fall under this label, that means you can do this and you can't do this. And there are these very rigid lines that you have to be inside of. And I find that to be kind of intimidating as someone who didn't quite really know who I was at the time and was also very afraid of messing up. And now that I am an F slur, I can see how illogical that was and how limiting it was for me to worry about how people would perceive my identity and my representation in my book in such a way. I think it is absolutely important in prioritizing authentic stories by people who share the same identity as their characters. And I do think there is a disproportionate amount of people who are in the mainstream of success with having stories where they don't necessarily reflect their characters' identities. I think the most obvious examples are women authors who write about gay men, especially if they exclusively write about gay men. There's so much discourse going on about that. If we lived in a world where gay male authors had as much success or more success than their female counterparts who are writing gay men stories, then I think there wouldn't be such criticisms in the first place. But we live in a reality where a lot of times people who don't share the identities of their characters are the ones who get to profit off of those stories. And I think that is totally valid for people to make those criticisms of. I think what makes it complicated though is that sexuality and gender are so fluid. And again, we kind of draw these very hard lines and kind of maybe get overzealous to a point where we say you can and you cannot write a certain thing because you are X, Y, and Z. I think that's why I was so conflicted at the time that I saw people make those assumptions about me and my intentions of writing queer characters, because I couldn't really blame them when I had clearly identified as straight. But at the same time, it made me feel sad about how shallow of an interpretation of my humanity was. I feel like that's hard to gauge because identities are not a monolith and there are so many different types of experiences that someone could could have. And there's no like council of members that can determine whether you write passes the test or not. And so while I don't have the answers to that, I do feel very lucky that I turned out to be queer later on, because I know for a fact that like if I had not discovered that part of myself, if I was not dating a woman in order to legitimize my sexuality, then I probably would continue to face scrutiny about the queer aspects of my book. And I would most definitely be constantly doubting myself and worrying about how I would write these characters, even though I feel like the reason behind it is totally legitimate. So while I don't think the reason why I made the characters queer women had anything to do with my own journey, it is kind of nice to see the parallels now with like how restrictive I felt in my real life to how the characters were restricted as well within the narrative. And then they have found this dream world where those restrictions are lifted off. And I shared this excerpt in the essay that I wrote for people.com. There's a chapter later on in the book where the main character experiences another dream that's separate from the main storyline going on. And it's kind of like an alternate universe where, you know, things are very peaceful and idyllic. And it's this future that she shares with the Sleeping Beauty character. We know that there could never be any kind of future like that happening in the real world, but it's nice to see that in this alternate universe where it's kind of like impossible. And so in this moment of peace that they have together, there is a line that says, "She was grateful for the freedom she had, one that could kiss a beautiful girl without restraint." And I feel like for me, that has been my understanding of queerness. It's not even like about the romantic aspect of it. It's just about the freedom of it. When I think about the relationship between my two main characters, I hesitate to even like advertise that it is like a romantic relationship, because I think that's going to set people up with the wrong expectations. I think the characters ended up connecting with each other in a deeper way, not necessarily because of attraction or because they wanted to like bang each other or anything like that, but it's more like they can understand this innate feeling of depression and restriction and the lack of freedom in the worlds that they came from, and like that desperation for hope and relief. Like, I don't think that queerness means that it is romantic. I think queerness is like more than that. It's more about like realizing you can be more than what you were before. I feel like the moral of the story that I'm trying to get in this video is that we should be more than just the rigid expectations that we have put upon other people, or what we expect certain stories or forms of media to reflect or represent. I hope that explanation makes sense. If it doesn't, I guess we can just say that I'm hopping on the bandwagon for the LGBT trend. I mean, hey, I didn't know sapphic stories were trendy, but maybe we should make it a trend. You know what I mean? I also want to continue this topic of representation with other things like race and class, because something that I learned as I developed like a fully frontal lobe is that if you don't explicitly state the race of your characters or the skin color of your characters, then people are going to automatically default the characters to be white. And so when I revisited the story, I wanted to make sure that if a character is going to be white or a person of color, that it would be a conscious decision on my part. And while I don't think that the story is about race, I do think that, similar to what I was saying about sexuality, by having the characters be different identities, it adds layers to the themes. So that lends into some tension between Corinne and Amelia when they meet in the dream world, because she points out the fact that people like Amelia are able to avoid what makes them uncomfortable, and they can retreat into imaginary worlds and cottagecore bullshit and pretend to have some kind of like whimsical, like romanticized life, whereas like other people like Corinne have to live with the consequences of wealthy, frivolous people like Amelia. They don't have fairies to grant them gifts that they are automatically given since birth. When they pass away or quote unquote sleep forever, people don't mourn for them on such like a wide national level, or they think people like Corinne are a necessary casualty to war. And so these are sentiments that had always been there in the first draft when I initially concepted this story. But now, like as an adult, being more socially conscious and politically conscious, I see how it adds a whole new layer when it is explicitly shown that Amelia is a white girl who comes from a very privileged background, and Corinne is a dark-skinned woman who comes from poverty. So I don't explicitly talk about race or class in the story, but I think the fact that like I was conscious about these characters' identities, it made those scenes of that tension and dialogue between the two characters have that extra weight to it. I will say, when it comes to race, I do think that authors of color have almost like an unfair standard where we are almost like expected to perform our culture through our writing instead of just simply existing the way that like white authors can. And I think maybe that's why initially I was so colorblind, because I felt like just because I'm Asian doesn't mean I need to write like an Asian fantasy or be expected to represent an entire culture. I knew that this story was specifically about depression and mental health, and so I wanted to stick to that. But I think the revelation that I've had with incorporating some racial elements is that yes, it is about mental health and depression, but so much of that is influenced by our identities and the unfortunate ways that we were born and the social implications of that too. And so that was another reason why it was important for me to show different facets of depression with both Corinne and Amelia. But Corinne is a dark-skinned woman and Amelia is a very pale white woman. They come from different class backgrounds. And so that impacts the ways that they have struggled in the world and how they deal with their depression. But both of the things that they feel are still valid. What I enjoyed about building their relationship was them seeing the parallels of their own grief and depression within each other and being able to like be closer from that, even though they're from like totally different backgrounds. And then the last woke identity politics bullshit that I added to my story was like in the third draft, when I was like rewriting it once again, I was thinking about the character arcs, right? And then I was thinking about Malicene, who was like the demon that had cursed Amelia and created this dream world in the first place. Their whole deal is that they have been ostracized by society because of the nature of their birth, not being a fairy, not being human, not even fully being a demon either. And so a lot of their character arc is about identity and belonging. And the more that I thought about how much they've deviated from like what's considered normal to the rest of the world and how they can't fit into any particular box, the more that I realized that it didn't really make any sense for this badass otherworldly creature to fit into any gender binary. Instead of Malicene being cisgender, it would make sense for them to be non-binary. I really do think that if I had remained straight for the rest of my life, I still would have led to that conclusion of turning the main characters queer women and of turning Malicene into a non-binary creature. I think there are all sorts of great reasons for why people want representation, but for me, it's less about feeling seen and more so just the fact that like stories are boring when everyone is the same. I think that exploring different identities and experience makes a way more interesting story because now it has different implications and dynamics and insights and even like tension. So yeah, that's just like my 2 cents about how I went from like a total ignorant, colorblind person that was just writing whatever story sounded fun, and now I got taken over by the woke virus and like now I'm really full SJW over here. But my argument is that I think it makes the story better. I think also we should have more stories where characters will be a certain identity and it has nothing to do with the story. It doesn't even have to like add another layer to their character arc at all. They can just simply exist as like a queer person or like a person of color or, you know, anything else. And I think that when we have more stories like that, that cover that full spectrum of being purposeful versus just being like random and put in there for the sake of like normalizing it, then that's how we actually have like genuine diversity rather than something like, oh, you're Asian, so you need to write an Asian fantasy. So that's my spiel. Anyway, with all of this done, I hope you enjoy the book if you decide to check it out. As for me, I'm actually gonna catch a flight right now to go on my book tour. So by the time this video is posted, I will see some of you there. And I think the next video I post, I'm gonna try to make like a roast video of my own book. So after I settle down from the tour, I'll start putting together that video and we can have fun, you know, just poking fun at the book because sometimes that's also how you can enjoy a story too. So yeah, with that in mind, I will see you next time. Goodbye.
Oh girl, why are you leaving me so blue? No girl, don't you know